A story of hidden strength and unexpected heroes. The fluorescent lights of Metro General's ambulance may cast harsh shadows across my weathered face as I checked my equipment for the third time that shift. At 57, Elena Vasquez had heard every joke, endured every sideways glance, and weathered every whispered conversation about the old lady, still running calls when she should be sitting behind a desk. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Abuela's still here? Snickered Marcus Chen, a 28-year-old paramedic whose pristine uniform and cocky attitude screamed rookie despite his 2 years on the job. His partner Jake Morrison laughed, shaking his head as they passed my rig. Someone should tell her Medicare doesn't cover workplace injuries, Jake added, loud enough for half the bay to hear. I've been working emergency medicine for 32 years, longer than these boys had been breathing. My hands had delivered babies in the back of speeding ambulances, performed CPR on children who reminded me of my own grandkids, and held the hands of dying patients who just needed someone to tell them they weren't alone. But all they saw was gray hair pulled back in a sensible bun and reading glasses hanging from a chain around my neck. What they didn't know, what I'd never told anyone at Metro General, was that before I became Elena Vasquez, grandmother of 4 and keeper of family recipes, I had been Lieutenant Elena Vasquez Rodriguez, trauma surgeon with the 3rd Medical Battalion, serving 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Before I learned to navigate the politics of hospital administration, I had performed emergency surgery in field hospitals while mortar rounds shook the walls and sand filtered through surgical masks. Vasquez. Chief Patterson's voice cut through the ambient noise of the ambulance bay. My office now. I followed him through the maze of equipment and personnel, past the break room where someone had taped a picture of a rocking chair to my locker with "Reserved for Elena" written in marker underneath. Patterson closed his office door and gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Elena, we need to talk." He pulled off his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes, a gesture I recognized from my own mirror. "There's been some concerns raised about your performance." "What kind of concerns?" "Response times, physical demands of the job, decision-making under pressure." He shuffled papers on his desk, avoiding my eyes. "Look, you've been a good paramedic for a lot of years, but maybe it's time to consider moving to dispatch or training. New recruits, less physical stress, regular hours." The words hit me like a physical blow. Who complained? It doesn't matter who. It was Chen and Morrison, wasn't it? The silence confirmed my suspicion. What exactly did they say? Patterson sighed heavily. "They said you hesitated during the cardiac arrest call last Tuesday. That you couldn't lift your share of equipment. That you're becoming a liability." I thought back to Tuesday's call. Mrs. Henderson, 73, found unconscious in her kitchen by her neighbor. While Chen and Morrison argued about protocols, I'd quickly assessed her condition and determined she wasn't in cardiac arrest, but suffering from severe hypoglycemia. My 30 years of experience told me to check her blood sugar first, not immediately. Start chest compressions. I'd been right. A simple glucose injection had brought her around completely. I saved that woman's life by thinking instead of just following protocols blindly, I said quietly. That may be true, but the fact remains you're not getting any younger. Elena, this job is for people who can handle the physical demands. I stared at him for a long moment. Patterson had been chief for 8 years, long enough to develop the institutional blindness that favored youth over experience, flash over substance. Are you firing me? I'm offering you alternatives. Think about it over the weekend. Let me know Monday what you want to do. As I walked back to my rig, I felt the weight of 3 decades of service pressing down on my shoulders. The young paramedics looked past me as if I'd already become invisible, already been relegated to the dusty corners of their profession where old-timers went to fade away quietly. that Friday started like any other. I'd spent the night thinking about Patterson's ultimatum, wondering if maybe he was right. Maybe I was too old, too slow, too set in my ways for modern emergency medicine. Maybe it was time to step aside and let the younger generation take over. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I was restocking supplies when the tones dropped. Unit 47, respond code 3 to Riverside Industrial Park, Building 12. Multi-vehicle accident with entrapment and possible casualties. Chen and Morrison were assigned as the primary unit. I was backup, the old lady bringing up the rear, probably to direct traffic or comfort family members, while the real paramedics did the important work. The scene was chaos when I arrived. A delivery truck had jackknifed, crushing a sedan against a concrete barrier. Steam rose from the twisted metal, and the acrid smell of burning oil mixed with something else. Something medical that made my old instincts kick into high alert. "We've got one critical in the sedan," Morrison shouted over the noise of approaching fire trucks. Male, approximately 30, unconscious, weak pulse, significant trauma to the chest and abdomen. I approached the wreckage and immediately recognized what Chen and Morrison were missing: the victim's positioning, the angle of impact, the specific pattern of damage to the vehicle. I'd seen it before, in a very different context. "Has anyone checked for internal bleeding?" I called out. "We're working on it, Abuela." Chen snapped without looking back. "Why don't you set up a perimeter?" Through the shattered driver's side window, I could see the victim clearly for the first time. Young, fit, with the distinctive haircut that suggested military service. But it was the small tattoo visible on his forearm that made my blood run. Cold, a trident anchored by an eagle. Navy SEAL, this wasn't just any accident victim. This was a warrior, someone who had probably saved countless lives himself in places most people couldn't even pronounce. And he was dying while two paramedics, with more ego than experience, fumbled through protocols they'd memorized, but never truly understood. "Chen!" I shouted, moving closer to the wreckage. "We need to establish 4 access and get blood volume expanders going immediately. This isn't just trauma, he's bleeding internally." "Back off, Vasquez," Morrison yelled. "We've got this handled." But they didn't have it handled. I could see from 20 feet away that they were treating the visible injuries while missing the real problem. The victim's blood pressure was dropping, his skin was taking on a grayish pallor, and his breathing was becoming increasingly shallow. Classic signs of hemorrhagic shock that would kill him long before they got him to a hospital. The fire department was still working to extract him from the vehicle. In a normal situation, that would be the right approach: stabilize, extract, transport. But this wasn't a normal situation. This young SEAL was dying, and every minute they spent following standard protocols was a minute closer to losing him completely. That's when I noticed something that made my decision for me. A piece of twisted metal from the truck's cargo area had penetrated the sedan's firewall, creating a puncture wound just below the victim's rib cage. The angle was almost surgical in its precision, and I realized with growing horror that the metal was acting as a plug, preventing catastrophic blood loss. The moment they moved him, he would bleed out in seconds. "Stop!" I shouted, pushing past Morrison to get closer to the wreckage. "Nobody moves him until we address the penetrating trauma." "Get her out of here!" Chen yelled to the fire chief. "She's interfering with patient care." But the fire chief, a grizzled veteran named Rodriguez who'd worked with me on dozens of calls over the years, hesitated. He'd seen me work before, seen me make calls that saved lives when younger, more aggressive paramedics would have made the situation worse. "What are you seeing, Elena?" he asked quietly. I pointed to the metal penetration. "That's plugging a major vessel. Could be the hepatic artery or portal vein based on the entry angle. The moment you extract him, he bleeds out," Morrison scoffed. "She's been watching too many medical dramas." We need to get him out of here and to a hospital. Look at his vitals, I said sharply. Blood pressure dropping, pulse climbing, skin color changing. He's already in stage 2 shock, maybe stage 3. He won't survive transport unless we control the bleeding here. Paramedics don't perform surgery, Chen shot back. That's not our job. Our job, I said, my voice taking on the tone of command I hadn't used in 20 years, is to save lives. The argument might have continued indefinitely, but the victim made the decision for us. His eyes fluttered open, and despite his critical condition, his training kicked in. He assessed the situation with the quick, methodical scan of someone accustomed to life or death circumstances. "Ma'am," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the noise of emergency vehicles. "Are you medical?" I knelt beside the wreckage, close enough that only he could hear me. "Yes. What's your name, son?" "Petty Officer First Class David Martinez," he managed. "SEAL Team 5. David, I'm Elena. I'm going to take care of you." His eyes found mine, and I saw the same look I'd seen in the faces of wounded soldiers half a world away, the desperate hope that someone with real knowledge and experience would take control of the situation. "How bad?" he asked. I glanced at the metal penetration, at his vitals, at the steady decline in his condition. In a hospital, with a full surgical team and proper equipment, his injuries would be serious but manageable. Here, trapped in twisted metal with 2 paramedics who couldn't see past their protocols, he was dying. "Bad enough that we need to do something unconventional," I told him honestly. He nodded slightly. "Do it." "Elena," Rodriguez called out. "What do you need?" Chen and Morrison were still arguing with the incident commander, insisting that proper protocol demanded immediate extraction and transport. They were following their training to the letter, but their training hadn't prepared them for this specific situation. "I need surgical kit from my rig," I called back. "And I need these 2 to either help or get out of my way." "You can't perform surgery in the field," Morrison protested. "You're not qualified." That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I pulled out my wallet and removed a card I hadn't shown anyone in 20 years, my military medical credentials, laminated and faded, but still official. "Lieutenant Elena Vasquez Rodriguez," I said, handing the card to Rodriguez. "Trauma surgeon, 3rd Medical Battalion. I performed more battlefield surgeries in Iraq and Afghanistan than most civilian doctors see in their entire careers." The ambulance bay fell silent except for the idle of diesel engines and the distant sound of radio chatter. Chen and Morrison stared at me as if I'd suddenly sprouted wings. "You're a doctor?" Chen asked, his voice small. "I was a doctor. Now I'm a paramedic who's about to save this young man's life if you'll stop arguing and start helping." Rodriguez handed me the surgical kit from my rig equipment I'd kept stocked far beyond normal paramedic protocols. Just in case, my hands moved with practiced efficiency, laying out instruments on a sterile cloth draped across the sedan's hood. "David," I said, leaning back down to the window, "I'm going to need to access the penetration site to control bleeding before we can move. I can't give you much for pain need to keep your blood pressure up." "Do what you have to do, Doc," he whispered. What happened next defied every protocol in the paramedic handbook, challenged every assumption about what emergency medical technicians could and couldn't do in the field. But sometimes the handbook doesn't cover what happens when 30 years of trauma surgery experience meets a dying Navy SEAL and 2 hours of gridlocked traffic between the accident scene and the nearest Level 1 trauma center. I worked through a hole in the vehicle's firewall no bigger than my fist, using a pen light for illumination and 30-year-old muscle memory to guide my hands. The first priority was to establish vascular control above and below the injury site. Using hemostats from my kit, I carefully clamped the damaged vessel, a branch of the hepatic artery, just as I'd suspected. "Blood pressure stabilizing," Morrison reported. his voice subdued. He was reading vitals while Chen prepared blood volume. Expanders, both of them following my instructions without question now. The metal fragment had lacerated the artery, but hadn't completely severed it. In a hospital, this would be a straightforward repair clamp, clean, suture, monitor. In the twisted wreckage of a sedan with limited access and no backup, it required improvisation that pushed the boundaries of field medicine. I need more light. I called out. Rodriguez appeared with a high-powered tactical flashlight, holding it steady while I worked. Using the technique I'd perfected in field hospitals where power failures were common and equipment was scarce, I performed a primary repair of the damaged vessel. My hands moved with the steady precision of someone who'd done this procedure dozens of times under much worse conditions, while mortar exploded outside, while sandstorms reduced visibility to near zero, while wounded soldiers waited there. Turn under fire. How are his vitals? I asked without looking up from my work. Blood pressure holding at 90/60, Chen reported. Pulse down to 110, color improving. The repair took 18 minutes. When I finished, David's vital signs had stabilized enough for safe extraction and transport. The fire department carefully cut away the vehicle's roof and door, maintaining spinal immobilization while I monitored the surgical site. As they loaded him onto the stretcher, David grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "Thank you," he said. "Simply, thank me when you're back on active duty," I replied, squeezing his hand gently. The ride to Metro General was surreal. Chen and Morrison maintained 4 access and monitored vitals while I kept pressure on the surgical site, all 3 of you was working as a team for the first time since I'd known them. The tension and rivalry that had defined our working relationship seemed to have evaporated, replaced by something like professional respect. "Elena," Morrison said quietly as we neared the hospital, "where did you learn to do that?" "Ramadi, 2007. I answered without elaborating. "Along with Fallujah, Kandahar, and about a dozen other places you've probably never heard of." At the hospital, I gave report to the trauma surgeon on duty, Dr. Sarah Kim, a woman about my daughter's age who listened to my account of the field surgery with professional interest and undisguised amazement. "You performed a primary arterial repair in a vehicle wreck?" she asked, reviewing my documentation. The alternative was watching him bleed out. Dr. Kim shook her head slowly. "In 30 years of emergency medicine, I've never seen field surgery at this level. This is textbook work, better than textbook." 3 hours later, she found me in the break room where I was finally allowing myself a cup of coffee and a moment to process what had happened. "He's stable," she reported. "Going to make a full recovery. The repair was perfect. Couldn't have done better myself in a fully equipped OR." "Good," I said simply. "Elena, can I ask you something? Why didn't you stay in medicine? With skills like yours, you could have written your own ticket at any hospital in the country." I thought about the question, about the choice I'd made 20 years ago to leave surgery behind for the simpler, more direct work of emergency medicine. About coming home from war and wanting to save lives without the politics and bureaucracy of hospital administration. About preferring the immediacy of ambulance work to the complicated hierarchies of academic medicine. "Different battles," I said finally. "Same war." Word of the field surgery spread through Metro General faster than gossip usually traveled. By the next morning, my story had reached the administration, the medical staff, and somehow the local news media. When I arrived for my shift, I found Chief Patterson waiting by my rig with an expression I'd never seen before, something between embarrassment and awe. "Elena, we need to talk," he said, but his tone was completely different from our conversation. 3 days earlier, about my retirement? He looked at the ground, about my being a complete ass. The apology was awkward, but genuine. Patterson explained that Chen and Morrison had both requested to speak with him privately, recounting the previous day's events and their own recognition of how wrong they'd been about their older colleague. They said you saved that SEL's life with skills they didn't even know existed outside of hospital ORS, Patterson said. They also said they'd been treating you poorly and wanted to make it right. I nodded, not particularly interested in rehashing old grievances. Is Martinez going to be okay? Full recovery expected. His commanding officer called this morning once to meet the paramedic who saved one of his men. That afternoon, Commander. James Harrison arrived at Metro General in dress whites, accompanied by 2 junior officers who looked like they could bench press my ambulance. Harrison was exactly what Central Casting would order for a Navy SEAL commander, tall, weathered, with the kind of presence that filled a room, even when he spoke quietly. Ms. Vasquez, he said, extending his hand. I understand we owe you a considerable debt. Just doing my job, Commander. According to my people, what you did yesterday went considerably beyond the normal scope of paramedic duties. I shrugged. Sometimes the job requires going beyond normal. Harrison studied me for a moment, and I recognized the assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating people under pressure. Petty Officer Martinez tells me you identified yourself as a former military surgeon. Could you tell me a bit about your service? For the next 20 minutes, I found myself recounting experiences I rarely discussed: the field hospitals, the improvised surgeries, the young soldiers whose lives had depended on decisions made under impossible circumstances. Harrison listened without interruption, asking only occasional clarifying questions that demonstrated his own understanding of combat medicine. Lieutenant, he said when I finished, using my former rank with quiet respect, what you did yesterday saved one of my best men. But more than that, you demonstrated the kind of calm professionalism under fire that defines the best military medical personnel. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small wooden box. This is a unit coin from SEAL Team 5. It's given to individuals who have significantly contributed to the safety and welfare of team members. Inside the box was a heavy metal coin bearing the SEAL Trident and team insignia. On the reverse was an engraving, Elena Vasquez, Guardian Angel, August 2023. Commander, this is unnecessary. It's not unnecessary, ma'am. It's overdue. The weeks that followed brought changes I hadn't expected and wasn't entirely comfortable with. The local news story about the paramedic who performed battlefield surgery attracted attention from medical journals, veterans organizations, and emergency services departments from neighboring counties. Dr. Kim approached me about consulting on trauma protocols for extreme circumstances. The state EMS director requested a meeting about developing advanced field surgery guidelines. 2 different hospitals offered me positions in their emergency departments, but the most significant change was in my daily work environment. Chen and Morrison had transformed from antagonists into eager students, asking questions about assessment techniques and requesting additional training in advanced trauma care. Other paramedics who had previously dismissed me as past my prime began seeking my opinions on difficult calls. Elena, Chen said one afternoon as we restocked equipment after a routine transport, would you mind if I asked you something personal? Shoot. Why? Didn't you ever tell us about your background? About being a surgeon? I thought about his question while organizing bandage supplies, because it wasn't relevant to the job I was doing. I'm a paramedic now, not a surgeon. The past is just context. But don't you think people would have treated you differently if they knew? People should treat each other with respect regardless of what they did 20 years ago, I said. The problem wasn't my background, it was your assumptions. Morrison, who had been listening from the driver's seat, turned around. We were idiots. You were young, I corrected. There's a difference. Young people think experience means slow, outdated, in the way. Sometimes experience just means you've seen enough situations to recognize patterns others miss. Like knowing Martinez was bleeding internally when his vitals didn't obviously show it yet. Like trusting your instincts when the textbook doesn't cover the specific circumstances you're dealing with. 2 months later, I was restocking supplies when a familiar voice called my name. David Martinez stood near the ambulance bay entrance, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of an active-duty SEAL. "Doc Vasquez," he said, approaching with a slight smile. "Got a minute?" He looked good, healthy color, full strength, no visible signs of the trauma that had nearly killed him. "How are you feeling, David?" 100%. "Doctors cleared me for full duty last week." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I wanted to thank you properly. And I wanted you to know what that day meant." We sat on a bench outside the ambulance bay while he explained his recovery, his return to training, and his upcoming deployment. But mostly he wanted to talk about the moment when he'd opened his eyes in that wrecked sedan and seen someone who understood both the severity of his situation and what needed to be done about it. "I've been in a lot of tight spots," he said. "Combat situations where everything was going wrong and it looked like we weren't going to make it out. The difference between surviving and not surviving usually comes down to one thing: having someone on your team who knows what they're doing and isn't afraid to do it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small package. "This is from the team, all of us." Inside was a medic's patch from SEAL Team 5, modified with my name and the date of the accident. "Honorary Team Medic," David explained. "It doesn't make you official Navy, but it makes you one of us." That evening, I sat in my apartment looking at the patch and thinking about the strange journey that had brought me to this point. From Army surgeon to civilian paramedic to whatever I was now, someone whose past and present had merged in ways I couldn't have predicted. My phone rang. Chief Patterson's voice was excited, almost breathless. "Elena, I just got off the phone with the state EMES director. They want to create a new position, senior medical consultant for extreme trauma situations. Someone who can provide advanced medical guidance when normal protocols aren't sufficient." "What would that involve?" "Training paramedics in advanced techniques, consulting on unusual cases, maybe writing new protocols based on your military experience." I looked at the patch in my hands, at the unit coin Commander Harrison had given me, at the small collection of thank you cards from patients and colleagues that had accumulated over the past weeks. "Can I think about it?" "Of course. But Elena, whatever you decide, I want you to know this department is lucky to have you. I was an idiot for not seeing it sooner." 6 months later, I found myself standing in front of a classroom filled with paramedics, EMTs, and emergency room nurses, teaching a course called Advanced Trauma Assessment for Extreme Circumstances. The state had officially adopted several protocols based on techniques I'd developed during my military service, adapted for civilian emergency medicine. Chen and Morrison were in the front row, having volunteered to be my first students in the new program. Both had shown remarkable growth in their assessment skills and decision-making abilities, transforming from protocol followers to thinking medical professionals. "The key to emergency medicine," I told the class, "isn't just knowing what to do in normal situations. It's knowing when normal isn't enough and having the confidence to adapt." After class, a young female paramedic approached me, someone who reminded me of myself 30 years earlier, trying to prove herself in a male-dominated field. "Ms. Vasquez," she said hesitantly, "I wanted to thank you for the training, but also thank you for showing us that experience isn't something to be dismissed. That being older and different doesn't mean being less capable." I thought about all the assumptions I'd endured, all the jokes about being past my prime, all the suggestions that I should step aside for younger, supposedly better paramedics. About the day when those assumptions almost cost a young warrior his life. "Being underestimated," I told her, "is sometimes an advantage. It means people don't see you coming until you've already done what needs to be done." She smiled and headed toward the door, then turned back. "One more question. Do you ever regret not staying in surgery? Not pursuing the more prestigious career?" I Looked out the classroom window at the ambulance bay where my rig was parked, where Chen and Morrison were checking equipment for the next shift, where another generation of emergency medical professionals was learning to save lives under pressure. Prestige is other people's opinion of what you do, I said. Purpose is knowing why you do it. I've never been confused about my purpose. That evening, as I drove home through Atlanta traffic, I thought about David Martinez, somewhere in the world on a mission that required the same calm competence under fire that had saved his life. About the young paramedics who were learning that experience and wisdom weren't obstacles to overcome, but resources to be valued. About my father, who had taught me that real strength wasn't about proving yourself to others, but about being ready. When someone's life depended on what you knew and what you could do. At a red light. I touched the small SEAL Team 5 patch one now wore on my uniform, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people nobody expects to fight them. The light turned green, and I drove toward home, past the city that had witnessed my transformation from dismissed husband to respected professional, past the hospital where David Martinez had recovered, past the lives that had been touched by the moment when experience met opportunity and proved that being called too old was just another challenge to overcome. In the distance, I could hear sirens. Someone, somewhere, needed help. Tomorrow I'd be back in the ambulance, ready to answer the call, carrying 3 decades of knowledge and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're capable of doing. Some stories end with vindication. Others end with recognition. This one ends with purpose and the understanding that true strength often comes disguised as something the world has learned to overlook. After all, they called me too old. They were wrong about that too. The end up. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.